I've already talked about the Irish drinking a lot of milk, but I want to go on about their drinking habits, or particularly where the stereotype comes from. Because in the 17th century, John Stephens, an Englishman, kept a diary while he was over in Ireland, and he said, "Beer and ale they seldom taste, unless they sell something considerable in a market town." Beer and ale wasn't drinking really in 17th century Ireland, but over in England it was pretty much essential because of how dirty the water was. However, the Irish fondness for milk sort of solved this problem, so they didn't need to drink beer and ale because they just drank milk. In the 18th century, companies like Guinness were set up, but I want to just give you some numbers. In 1719, 600,000 barrels were brewed in Ireland of beers and ales, not necessarily Guinness, and 300 barrels were imported. But by the 1760s, this number had dropped to below 600,000. At this time had a population of around 5 million people, just twice that of Ireland, but it was producing about 16 million barrels of beer. But it's quite hard to see just how much people drank during that time. We know during the American Revolution they were given a gallon of rum a month, and there was a gin epidemic in London, and Sir John Harington gave 90 gallons of wine to each of his archers during the 100 Years' War. In the book Alcohol in Western Society from Antiquity to 1800, it estimates that in the early modern period anyway, Polish peasants drank around 3 litres of beer a day, Danish sailors drank around a gallon, and people in Coventry drank 17 pints a week, so far more than what people were drinking in Ireland. Even when alcohol consumption was on the rise in the early 19th century, Theobald Matthew, a teetotaler, managed to convince around half the population of Ireland to give up alcohol completely. But shortly afterwards, the Great Famine struck, and this is when it becomes a little bit dubious. People say that during the famine, well, after the famine, people began to drink out of despair, but I find this a little bit hard to believe because there's nothing to indicate the Irish started drinking a hell of a lot more during this period, or any more than anywhere else, because, as an example, in Brittany, factory workers drank about 6 litres of wine a day. Could find, however, one time the Irish began to drink a hell of a lot during the 19th century, and that's in the 1880s, when pharmacies and travelling salesmen began to sell ether, of all things. And in 1891, Norman Kerr from the American Medical Association said that the Irish were a slave to ether, but eventually the government stepped in and this, let's say, craze died out. We go to the 20th century, I found one article by Philip O'Dwyer that makes an estimate about how much each nationality drank on average. And in the 1950s, the Irish drank roughly the same as the Americans, but less than, say, the British and Belgians. But by 1960, the Swiss, the Danes and the Germans were all drinking more than the Irish as well. However, by the 1990s, the Irish started to drink a hell of a lot more, and now even more so. The Irish were, for a long time in history, one of the most sober nations in Europe, so it's hard to explain exactly why the stereotype came about. But here's some options, let's say, well, some theories. First of all, after the famine and the mass emigration from Ireland, many of the people who went abroad were young men, and as such, as is always the case with young men abroad with money to burn, they started to spend that money on alcohol. Many of these workmen, particularly those working in the UK, would return home, and you could say that they might have introduced a new drinking culture to Ireland. So it could have been a negative stereotype that just sort of became true. You can see how this stereotype has actually impacted Ireland's drinking habits quite a bit, because before the 1970s, St. Patrick's Day was a sober affair. However, since in America they began associating it with drinking, they now do in Ireland. Of course, they're doing this to attract tourists to come to Dublin or wherever on St. Patrick's Day, but now more and more Irish people are drinking on St. Patrick's Day. So it seems that that stereotype has impacted Ireland quite a bit. Of course, this all could be wrong, but I can't think of another way to explain how Ireland, which was once the most sober nation in Europe, got this negative stereotype.